I stood completely still in the grand marble foyer of the million-dollar estate, while my daughter-in-law Ashley screamed in my face. She gripped a crystal champagne flute so tight, I thought the glass would shatter in her hand. She pointed her manicured finger right at my faded cardigan and called me a pathetic gold digger trying to leech off her husband's success. She laughed bitterly, telling her wealthy guests that I was just a broke old woman begging for a handout and ruining her perfect life. She was so convinced she was the queen of the castle. She felt completely untouchable. But her smug, arrogant smile vanished the very second the heavy oak front doors swung open. Mr. Sterling, the senior wealth manager from the private bank, stepped into the foyer. Ashley immediately changed her tone, smoothing her designer dress and stepping forward to greet him, assuming he was there to approve the massive new loan she had been demanding. Instead, Mr. Sterling walked right past her outstretched hand without even a glance. He stopped entirely in front of me, bowed his head respectfully, and handed me a thick leather folder. "Madam Director," he said, his voice echoing clearly across the silent room. "The eviction papers for the current occupants of your estate are ready for your signature." The look of pure, unadulterated terror on her face in that moment is something I will cherish for the rest of my life. My name is Brenda. I am 65 years old, and for 40 of those years, I worked the graveyard shift as a head nurse at the county hospital. I wiped bodies, I held the hands of the dying, and I saved every single penny I ever made, so my son Andre would never have to know the struggles I endured. I raised that boy on my own. I worked triple shifts so he could go to college graduate debt-free and start his own business. I loved him more than breath itself. But love can sometimes make a mother blind to the vipers her children bring into the fold. When Andre's business hit rock bottom 3 years ago, he was entirely too proud to ask me for help. But a mother always knows when her child is drowning. What Andre did not know was that I had spent decades quietly investing my overtime pay into real estate. I was far from the poor pensioner everyone assumed I was. I secretly bought that luxury mansion through an anonymous trust I named Oasis Holdings. I let Andre move in rent-free, telling him the house belonged to a wealthy former patient who owed me a favor. I just wanted my son to have a safe place to rebuild his pride and his life. A year later, he married Ashley. She was 32, raised in a world of high credit card debt and endless entitlement. She took one look at that sprawling estate and decided she had hit the absolute jackpot. She truly believed Andre was a self-made millionaire, and because I wanted my son to have a peaceful marriage, I played along. I kept my mouth shut. I stayed in my modest 2-bedroom apartment, wore my old clothes and played the part of the humble working-class mother. But Ashley could never hide her sheer disgust for my roots. The disrespect started small, with her rolling her eyes at my homemade meals or making snide comments about my sensible shoes. I swallowed my pride for the sake of my boy, but the quiet disrespect was about to turn into open warfare. It all started the afternoon I drove over to surprise Andre with a fresh peach cobbler, only to walk through the front door and find the house turned completely upside down. For 40 years, the smell of hospital bleach and the hum of fluorescent lights were my constant companions. Most people looked at me and saw just another tired black woman in faded scrubs, working the graveyard shift to make ends meet. They saw a widow raising a boy on her own clipping coupons and taking the bus. What they did not see was the woman sitting in the hospital break room at 3 a.m, studying real estate markets and reading financial journals. Every time I worked a holiday, every time I took a double shift, I took that extra money and quietly bought property. I started with a small duplex, then a 4-unit building, and over the decades my portfolio grew. I built a mountain of silent wealth, completely hidden from the world, because my only goal was to make sure my son Andre would never have to struggle the way I did. Andre was a brilliant boy. He grew into a hard-working man and launched his own logistics company. I was so incredibly proud. But the business world is ruthless, and 3 years ago a bad contract and a sudden market crash took everything he had built. I watched my strong, ambitious son wither away under the weight of crushing debt. The light completely left his eyes. He was too proud to ask his mother for a dime, and I knew that just handing him a check would shatter what little dignity he had left. A mother knows how to heal her child without leaving a scar. I called my financial advisor and made my biggest move yet. Through an anonymous trust I named Oasis Holding, I purchased a sprawling luxury estate in a highly exclusive neighborhood, paying entirely in cash. I had an attorney contact Andre, presenting a fabricated story about a silent investor who believed in his business and wanted to provide him with rent-free executive housing for 5 years. My son broke down in tears of gratitude. He moved into that mansion, and the stability gave him the peace of mind he needed to rebuild his company. He had no idea his humble mother was the invisible hand holding him up. About a year after he moved into the estate, Andre met Ashley. She was a 32-year-old woman who carried herself with a heavy sense of entitlement, always chasing a lifestyle far beyond her means. When she saw Andre living in a multi-million-dollar home and driving a nice car, her eyes lit up with dollar signs. She assumed he was a self-made millionaire, completely loaded with cash and ready to fund her wildest dreams. They were married within 10 months. I sat quietly in the back row at their lavish wedding, smiling politely as her family looked right through me. I wanted my son to be happy, and if he loved her, I was determined to make it work. I kept my mouth shut. I stayed in my simple 2-bedroom apartment across town, drove my 10-year-old sedan, and fully embraced the role of the poor pension-living mother. I thought my humility would keep the peace, but it only gave Ashley permission to treat me like dirt. From the moment she moved in, her distaste for my working-class demeanor was obvious. The microaggressions were a daily occurrence. If I came over, she would immediately wipe down the kitchen counter the second I moved my purse. She would loudly offer to buy me new clothes, claiming my sweaters were an embarrassment to their neighborhood. She hated when I parked my old car in the driveway, telling me it ruined the aesthetic of her home. She treated me not like a mother, but like a lingering nuisance she was forced to endure. I sat at my own kitchen island, drinking from a cheap mug, biting my tongue until it bled. I swallowed every single insult, every eye roll, and every condescending sigh, just to protect my son's happiness. I let her parade around my beautiful house, playing the wealthy lady of the manor, completely blind to the reality beneath her feet. I thought my silence was an act of love, but I would soon learn that it only fed her greed. It was a crisp Tuesday afternoon when I decided to bake my son his favorite homemade peach cobbler. I spent hours in my small kitchen, peeling fresh peaches and rolling out the crust perfectly, just the way he loved it since he was a little boy. I packed the warm glass baking dish into a simple insulated carrier and drove my 10-year-old sedan up the long, winding driveway of the estate. I expected a quiet afternoon visit. Instead, I found the heavy oak front doors propped wide open and a massive moving truck parked aggressively on the pristine front lawn. I stepped into the foyer and was immediately hit by the chaotic sound of heavy boots scraping against the polished floors. Right in the middle of the grand entryway sat a mountain of cheap canvas duffel bags, battered cardboard boxes, and a stack of dirty guitar cases. Standing in the center of the mess was Connor. Connor was Ashley's 34-year-old brother, a man who possessed a horrifying combination of extreme laziness and unearned arrogance. He was loudly directing 2 exhausted movers to carry his things up the sweeping staircase and directly into the primary guest suite. I stood there, clutching my warm dish, completely frozen in shock. Ashley marched out of the dining room, barking orders with her phone pressed to her ear. She was moving her deadbeat brother into my son's house without so much as a warning. I knew for an absolute fact that Andre would never allow this. My son valued his privacy and his peace above everything else after his business struggles, but Ashley did not care about what my son wanted. She operated as if the entire estate was her personal kingdom, and Andre was just a bank account attached to it. When she finally noticed me standing by the door, her face twisted into a mask of pure irritation. She did not say hello. She did not ask how I was doing. She just glared at the plastic carrier in my hands as if I had dragged mud across her expensive floors. I forced a polite smile, trying to keep the peace, and told her I brought a dessert for Andre. She rolled her eyes heavily, snatched the dish from my hands without a single word of thanks, and ordered me to follow her into the kitchen. The tension in the air was so thick it was suffocating. The kitchen was a massive chef's dream, covered in white marble and brushed steel. Ashley slammed my glass dish onto the island counter so hard I flinched, genuinely afraid the dish would shatter. She spun around to face me, and the mask of forced civility she usually wore around my son was completely gone. She looked me up and down with obvious revulsion, her eyes lingering on my faded wool cardigan and the scuffed toes of my sensible walking shoes. She crossed her arms and leaned against the counter, looking down her nose at me. She told me I needed to stop coming by unannounced with my cheap homemade food, but the insults about my baking were just the warm-up. She took a deep breath, puffed out her chest, and told me that things were going to change around there. She announced with a cruel, satisfied smirk that Andre was officially cutting off my little monthly allowance. My heart dropped, not because of the money, but because of the sheer malice in her voice. Ever since Andre had gotten back on his feet, he had been quietly sending me $200 a month. It was not a lot of money, and I certainly did not need it given my own hidden wealth, but I accepted it because it made my son feel proud. It was his way of taking care of his mother. Ashley had clearly found the bank statements and completely lost her mind. She pointed her sharp acrylic nail in my face and told me that she would not allow me to siphon away her husband's hard-earned cash. She called me a parasite. She said I was a grown woman who needed to stop leeching off their success. I felt the heat rise in my cheeks. My hands began to tremble with a mixture of profound shock and rising righteous anger. I had scrubbed hospital floors and worked double shifts for decades to pave the road she was currently strutting on. But before I could even open my mouth to defend myself, Ashley reached into her expensive leather handbag and pulled out a glossy, folded piece of paper. She shoved it aggressively against my chest. I instinctively grabbed it. It was a brightly coloured brochure for a state-funded low-income nursing home located 2 counties over. I knew the place from my years working in the medical field. It was a miserable, run-down facility known for severe understaffing and tragic neglect. Ashley crossed her arms again and told me it was time for me to face reality. She said I was getting old, I was becoming a burden, and I needed to stop draining their marital assets. She told me to pack my bags, sell my cheap apartment, and check myself into this facility where people of my socioeconomic class truly belonged. She stared at me with completely dead, merciless eyes and said she was reclaiming her family's wealth. The absolute audacity of this woman standing inside the multi-million-dollar home I secretly owned, threatening to throw me into a destitute facility to protect a fortune that actually belonged entirely to me, was staggering. I was so utterly stunned by her cruelty that the words caught in my throat. My vision blurred with tears of deep betrayal. I did not scream. I did not cry in front of her. I simply turned around and walked out of the kitchen, clutching that terrible brochure in my trembling hands. I walked quickly down the long hallway toward the front door, desperate to just escape the house and breathe. My chest was incredibly tight, and my mind was racing. Before I reached the grand foyer, I felt entirely too dizzy to drive. I needed just one moment of fresh air to compose myself, so I quietly slipped out through the side glass doors onto the expansive back patio. I sat down heavily on a wrought iron garden bench, hidden perfectly behind a large row of potted palm trees. I just wanted to close my eyes and stop my hands from shaking. But a few seconds later, the main terrace doors swung open. Ashley and Connor walked out, holding tall glasses of expensive imported beer. They sat down at the outdoor dining table, just a few yards away from my hiding spot. I froze, holding my breath. Connor took a loud sip of his drink and immediately started whining about his failing business. He was trying to open some ridiculous craft brewery downtown, but his credit was completely ruined and the banks had laughed him out of their offices. He aggressively asked his sister when the money was going to be ready. That is when Ashley laughed, a cold, calculating sound that sent ice straight through my veins. She told him to stop panicking because she had everything perfectly under control. She proudly revealed her master plan. She explained that she had been relentlessly bullying my son Andre into taking out a massive second mortgage on the estate. She bragged about how she had guilt-tripped him for weeks, telling him that a good husband would support his wife's family unconditionally. The loan was for hundreds of thousands of dollars, completely leveraging the equity of the home just to hand cold, hard cash to her deadbeat brother. Connor chuckled greedily, but asked what they were going to do about Andre's mother knowing my son was protective of me. Ashley let out a harsh, cruel sigh. She called me a pathetic leech who was constantly hovering around trying to steal their shine. She confidently told Connor that she had already planted the seed about my declining mental health. She said that once the massive loan was approved and the cash was safely transferred into her personal bank account, she was going to force Andre to declare me incompetent. Once we get the cash, we will stick the old lady in that cheap state home, change all the locks, and finally live the way we deserve, she sneered. I sat completely paralyzed behind those palm trees as the full scope of her demonic greed washed over me. She was not just disrespectful. She was actively plotting to destroy my son's financial future and completely erase me from his life. I pressed my back against the cold stone wall, clutching my purse to my chest. The heartbreaking sorrow I had felt just moments before instantly evaporated into the warm afternoon air. I sat completely still behind those large potted palm trees as the vicious laughter of my daughter-in-law and her deadbeat brother drifted through the warm afternoon air. Just a few moments before my heart was breaking into a million tiny pieces. I was mourning the disrespect and the quiet cruelty I thought I had to endure just to keep my son happy. But hearing Ashley proudly lay out her master plan to steal my wealth and lock me away in a destitute facility changed everything. The tears that had been welling up in my eyes dried instantly. The deep sorrow in my chest evaporated and was replaced by a cold, hard focus. I felt a powerful shift deep within my soul. I was no longer the wounded mother trying to keep the peace. I was a matriarch whose legacy was under attack by a greedy little girl who had absolutely no idea who she was dealing with. They mistook my kindness for weakness and my silence for ignorance. They looked at my faded cardigan and my sensible shoes and saw an easy target. They did not see the woman who had spent 40 years navigating the brutal politics of a county hospital. They did not see the woman who had negotiated massive real estate deals in cash while they were still in grade school. I did not storm out onto the patio and scream. I did not burst into tears and confront them with their own wickedness. Screaming is what powerless people do when they want to be heard. I did not need to be heard because I already held all the cards. I slowly stood up from the wrought iron bench. I smoothed down the front of my skirt and took a deep, steadying breath. I walked back into the house through the side doors, moving with quiet purpose. I walked right past the massive chef kitchen where I had just been handed that disgusting nursing home brochure. I walked through the grand marble foyer, stepping right over Connor and his pile of dirty canvas duffel bags. I did not say a single word. I opened the heavy oak front doors and walked out into the bright sunlight with my head held high. I got into my 10-year-old sedan and started the engine. As I drove down the long, winding driveway of my own multi-million-dollar estate, I looked at the beautiful manicured lawns and the towering trees I had paid for with my own blood and sweat. Ashley thought she was a genius playing a game of chess against an old fool, but she was playing checkers on a board that I owned outright. My anger was no longer a wild fire burning me alive. It was a perfectly controlled flame, and I was going to use it to burn her entire fantasy to the ground. I gripped the steering wheel of my car, feeling a sense of absolute clarity I had not felt in years. For so long I had made myself small to make room for my son and his new bride. I had swallowed my pride and hidden my accomplishments because I wanted Andre to feel like the man of the house, but my sacrifice had only invited vultures into our lives. By the time I pulled into the parking lot of my modest 2-bedroom apartment, my plan was fully formed. I was going to let Ashley believe she was winning. I was going to let her run her mouth and plan her lavish future with stolen money. And then right when she reached the absolute peak of her arrogance, I was going to pull the rug out from under her so fast she would not even have time to brace for the fall. The moment I walked through the front door of my apartment, I locked the deadbolt and went straight to my bedroom closet. Hidden beneath a stack of old winter coats was my heavy steel fireproof safe. I spun the combination dial, pulled the heavy door open, and took out a thick leather binder stamped with the name Oasis Holdings, LLC. I carried the binder to my small kitchen table and opened it up, spreading the heavy legal documents across the worn wooden surface. I picked up my phone and dialed the direct private line of Mr. Sterling, my senior wealth manager at the private bank. Mr. Sterling was a sharp, highly respected financial bulldog who had managed my portfolio for the last 15 years. When he answered, I did not waste time with pleasantries. I told him exactly what was happening at the estate. I listened to the quiet rustle of paper on his end of the line as he pulled up the trust accounts. He confirmed exactly what I already knew, because the estate was owned entirely by Oasis Holdings, LLC. And I was the sole managing director of that trust. Andre did not have the legal authority to take out a second mortgage. He did not own a single brick of that house. Ashley had zero equity, zero rights, and absolutely no power. Any loan application they submitted would trigger a mandatory review by the true owner of the property, which was me. Mr. Sterling chuckled dryly over the phone, noting that Ashley was trying to mortgage a castle she was only visiting. I instructed Mr. Sterling to immediately block any and all financial inquiries regarding the property address. But I was not going to stop there. I needed to send a message so loud and clear that she would never recover from the embarrassment. I told Mr. Sterling to draft a formal 24-hour eviction notice for Connor. I wanted it printed on the heaviest, most intimidating legal paper his firm possessed. Then I instructed him to draft a comprehensive cease and desist order for Ashley, detailing her attempted mortgage fraud and officially stripping her of any perceived rights to the property. I wanted a devastating legal reality check that would expose her lies to everyone. Mr. Sterling assured me the documents would be bulletproof and ready for my signature within the week. I thanked him and hung up the phone. I sat alone in my quiet kitchen, running my fingers over the official deeds and trust papers. A deep sense of peace washed over me. The trap was set and the jaws were completely hidden. I spent the next several days completely ignoring Ashley and her frantic attempts to push the loan through. I did not answer her text messages. I did not answer my son when he called sounding stressed and confused. I just waited. I knew Ashley was too impatient and entirely too arrogant to keep quiet for long. She would want to celebrate her impending victory. I knew she would throw a party. Women like Ashley cannot achieve anything without an audience to applaud them. She would gather her snooty friends and her freeloading family to toast to the massive loan she thought was just days away from approval. That would be my moment. I would let her build her house of cards as high as she possibly could, and then I would invite the heavy winds of justice to blow it all down. I packed my legal documents back into my safe, closed the heavy steel door, and smiled. It was a Friday evening, just exactly 2 weeks later, when I knew the time had come to execute my plan. I had received word through my son that Ashley was hosting a massive private dinner party at the estate. She had hired a private chef, a string quartet, and a team of valets. She told Andre it was just a simple gathering to celebrate Connor finding investors for his brewery. But I knew the truth. She was throwing a victory party to celebrate the massive loan she thought was practically in her bank account. I dressed carefully that evening. I did not put on a gown or expensive jewelry. I wore my same comfortable faded wool cardigan, my simple navy blue skirt, and my sensible walking shoes. I wanted her to see exactly who she was trying to destroy. I wanted her to look at the working-class mother she despised right as I took away her entire kingdom. I drove my 10-year-old sedan up the long, winding driveway and parked right between two luxury sports cars. The front doors were wide open, and the sound of classical music and clinking champagne glasses drifted out into the cool night air. I walked into the grand marble foyer and stepped into the massive formal dining room. There were at least 40 people standing around dressed in expensive designer clothes. Ashley was standing at the head of the long table, holding a crystal champagne flute, completely glowing with arrogance. When she spotted me standing quietly in the doorway, the smile vanished from her face. The string quartet stopped playing, and a heavy, uncomfortable silence fell over the entire room. Ashley stomped over to me, her face completely flushed with rage. She demanded to know what I was doing there and how I had gotten past her security. I stood my ground and calmly told her I was there to see my son. Ashley let out a harsh, bitter laugh that echoed across the silent room. She turned to her wealthy guests and pointed her manicured finger right at my chest. She called me a pathetic gold digger trying to leech off her husband's success. She told everyone that I was just a broke old woman begging for a handout and ruining her perfect life. She screamed that I was completely obsessed with her money and that I belonged in a cheap nursing home. She signaled for her deadbeat brother Connor, who immediately stepped forward, rolling up his sleeves. Connor stepped aggressively into my personal space, trying to intimidate me with his height. He told me I had overstayed my welcome and that it was time for the trash to be taken out. I did not flinch. I did not step back. I looked that lazy, overgrown boy right in his eyes and dared him to lay a single finger on me. Ashley was practically vibrating with fury, screaming that I was trespassing on her property. She demanded someone call the police to have me arrested. But just as she raised her voice to a hysterical pitch, the heavy brass doorbell echoed loudly through the grand foyer, stopping everyone dead in their tracks. The sudden ringing of the doorbell cut through the thick tension in the room like a sharp knife. Ashley immediately stopped screaming. She smoothed down the front of her expensive designer dress and took a deep breath, rapidly changing her entire demeanor. She whispered to Connor that it must be the representative from the mortgage bank, dropping off the final approval documents for the massive loan. A sickeningly sweet smile spread across her face as she practically ran toward the heavy oak front doors, pushing past me entirely. She swung the doors open wide, ready to welcome her financial savior. Standing on the front porch was Mr. Sterling. He was dressed in a sharp, custom-tailored suit, holding a thick black leather briefcase. Standing directly behind him was a uniformed legal courier carrying a large stack of official sealed envelopes. Ashley immediately extended her hand, flashing her brightest, most charming smile. She welcomed him to her home and told him she had been expecting him all evening. She offered him a glass of expensive champagne and tried to usher him into the grand dining room to meet her guests. But Mr. Sterling did not smile back. He did not reach out to shake her hand. He stood completely still on the threshold, radiating an intimidating aura of absolute authority. He looked at Ashley with a cold, calculating expression that made her nervous smile falter. He politely but firmly informed her that he was not there to attend a party, and he certainly was not there to approve alone. He stepped past her outstretched hand and walked straight into the grand marble foyer, his expensive leather shoes clicking sharply against the floor. He completely ignored the crowd of wealthy guests and the confused whispers filling the room. He walked right past Connor, who was still standing aggressively near the dining room entrance. Mr. Sterling stopped entirely when he reached me. The entire room watched in absolute stunned silence as this powerful senior wealth manager bowed his head respectfully to the old woman in the faded cardigan. "Madam Director," he said, his voice echoing clearly and powerfully across the silent room, "I apologize for the intrusion during your evening, but the urgent legal documents you requested are fully prepared." He opened his thick black leather briefcase and pulled out the heavy leather folder stamped with the Oasis Holdings crest. He handed it to me with both hands, treating me with the utmost reverence and respect. He turned slightly to address the room, speaking in a crisp, professional tone. He announced that the formal eviction papers for the current unauthorized occupants of the estate were ready for my immediate signature. The look of pure, unadulterated terror that washed over Ashley's face in that moment is something I will cherish for the rest of my life. Her mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. The champagne flute she had been gripping slipped from her hand and shattered loudly against the marble floor, sending glass flying everywhere. The guests began whispering frantically, stepping back from Ashley, as if she had suddenly caught a disease. Connor looked completely bewildered, staring dumbly at the leather folder in my hands. Ashley finally found her voice, her pitch completely frantic as she demanded to know what was going on. She yelled at Mr. Sterling that there must be some kind of mistake, because this was her house and her husband was the sole owner. Mr. Sterling adjusted his glasses and looked at her with pure professional disdain. He informed her that she was severely mistaken. He stated clearly for everyone to hear that the multi-million-dollar estate was owned entirely in cash by a private trust. And the sole managing director of that trust, the absolute owner of the very ground she was standing on, was the woman she had just threatened to throw into the street. I took a slow, deliberate step forward, opening the heavy leather folder. I looked at Ashley, who was now trembling uncontrollably, her face completely drained of color. I spoke in a calm, authoritative voice that commanded the absolute attention of every single person in the room. I told her that Andre did not own a single brick of this house. I told her she was never the lady of the manor, but simply a guest in my home, and she had just completely worn out her welcome. I pulled the first heavily stamped document from the folder and handed it directly to Connor. I informed him that it was a formal 24-hour eviction notice, effective immediately. I told him if he and his dirty duffel bags were not off my property by tomorrow evening, I would have the police escort him out in handcuffs. Connor snatched the paper, his face turning bright red, and backed away without saying a word. Then I turned my full attention back to Ashley. I looked her right in her terrified eyes and told her that the massive second mortgage application she had forced my son to submit was officially cancelled. I told her she would never see a single dime of my wealth, and she would never have the power to lock me away in a rundown facility. Just then, Andre pushed his way through the crowd of stunned guests. He had heard every single word from the hallway. He looked at the legal documents. He looked at Mr. Sterling, and then he looked at his wife. The truth hit him like a freight train. He finally realized the depths of her deceit and the horrifying disrespect she had inflicted upon his mother. He did not yell. He walked up to Ashley, his voice completely cold and broken, and he told her she was a toxic, greedy woman, and he was an absolute fool for bringing her into our family. He told her they were entirely done, and that she needed to pack her things and leave. Ashley broke down into hysterical sobbing. She fell to her knees right in the middle of the grand marble foyer, begging Andre to forgive her, claiming she just wanted the best for their future. But he turned his back on her, refusing to even look at her face. The wealthy, snooty friends she had invited to flaunt her fake success were already quietly slipping out the front doors, completely embarrassed to be associated with her. Ashley was left kneeling in a puddle of spilled champagne and shattered crystal, utterly powerless, humiliated and entirely stripped of the kingdom she had tried so desperately to steal. She reached out to grab my skirt, begging me to give her another chance, but I simply stepped back, leaving her grasping at empty air. I looked down at the woman who had called me a gold digger and told her that true wealth is not something you marry into, and it is certainly not something you steal. True wealth is built quietly with hard work and unwavering dignity, things she would never possess. The justice was absolute, and the air in my home finally felt completely clean. In the weeks that followed that explosive night, the dust finally settled and absolute peace returned to my home. Connor was forced to pack his cheap canvas duffel bags and is currently living in a dingy roadside motel on the edge of town with his ridiculous brewery dreams completely shattered. Ashley is now facing a brutal divorce because the multi-million-dollar estate and all of its assets belong entirely to my private trust. She walked away with absolutely zero marital assets to claim. Her high society friends abandoned her the very moment they realized she was completely broke and utterly powerless. As for me, I finally moved out of my small 2-bedroom apartment and took my rightful place in the master suite of the estate. Tonight, Andre and I are sitting quietly together on the back patio, drinking warm, sweet tea under the stars. The heavy burden of his toxic marriage is gone, replaced by a deep, unspoken gratitude between a hard-working mother and her son. Looking out over the beautifully manicured lawns, I reflect on the fact that true wealth is never about the expensive designer clothes you wear to impress strangers. True wealth is about the power you quietly control and the peace of mind that comes from protecting your legacy. Sometimes you have to let a fool talk themselves right into a trap, honey. If you have ever had to remind someone who really holds the keys, hit that like button and subscribe. And before you go, tell me down in the comments, where are you watching from, what time is it there? And how would you have handled a daughter-in-law like Ashley? Stay blessed and never let anyone mistake your grace for weakness.